We have talked a lot about the housing market on this channel over the past few months. If you didn't know, the housing market has gone through a pretty transformative change over the last 2 years. We have basically seen housing prices increase by 20% or more in some areas over the last 2 years. That has created a lot of inflation in the housing market industry and a lot of other problems with material and supply and demand. We've also talked a lot about how inflation and monetary policies have influenced the housing market in 2020 and in parts of 2021. However, I saw this super interesting article on Bloomberg about why housing prices increasing might be a little bit more complicated than just inflation. In fact, there are a ton of other factors and cultural factors at play when it comes to why housing prices might be exploding in the United States and why they may continue to explode in 2022, despite a lot of the Federal Reserve and our monetary policies shifting next year. So today I'm going to break down this article from Bloomberg and talk to you about everything that is going on in the housing market today and what this all could mean for prices and our economy in 2022. But before I break all of this down, my name is Nate from Minority Mindset News, and if you like this video, then smash that thumbs up button below and hit that notification bell too. That way YouTube shows our videos to way more money minds around the world, and we can keep making videos just like this one. So basically, the article talks about a fundamental shift that we have had in our society over the past few decades. It specifically mentions starting in the late 1990s, our cities and our economy was starting to explode in the United States. People were starting to move away from the suburbs and into the city. And I think this is because we had such a young generation of people that wanted to go to where life was really happening. And the suburbs definitely weren't that. All of our cities in the United States, even to this day, are pinnacles of technological and cultural advancements. We see a lot of things happen in the city because a ton of people live in cities. You have a ton of different ideas in the cities. You have a ton of money being poured into these cities, which means that people need to be very constructive and creative about how they live and how they interact with the city around them. And our job market and the way people made money started to change in the 80s and 90s. America was starting to outsource a lot of its material jobs. So as you can probably see with a lot of our clothes and a lot of our materials, they're all made overseas. There's not a lot that is made in America today. A lot of our goods and services are made in other places. And what that meant is a lot of these factories and a lot of these places that people worked at to create these goods, those jobs were going away because they were all going to places like China. As those jobs started to disappear, people started to move to the cities, a place where they could get a different type of job, something that was still going to pay them a lot of money. People started to move to the cities and away from the suburbs. Now we've seen this year after year until the year 2020. Now nothing really changed in the job market or in our culture that made people want to leave cities. In the beginning parts of 2020, our cities were still booming. However, by March of 2020, the pandemic really started to pick up and people started to move away from the cities and back to the suburbs. And there are a few different reasons for this. For one, the pandemic and the virus really wasn't conducive with an environment where there were millions of people all living in close proximity. I mean, if you think of a city like New York City and some of the images and videos that you can find online, that is an urban jungle. And there are millions and thousands of people spread across almost every single street. The opportunity for you to contract the virus was a lot higher. So people, at least temporarily, started to move out of cities. And that could only mean that they need to live somewhere. So they started to move to the suburbs and they started to buy houses. And the second reason is because people pay a lot to live in the city. There is not a lot of places to live. There is only so much real estate to go around. So people can sometimes spend thousands of dollars just living in a decent apartment in New York City or San Francisco versus you could spend the same amount of money in a suburb and get 10 times the amount of living space and your own home. Ultimately, I think people started to realize that in 2020. They realized that they needed to move out of the city in order to save money. And the reason they needed to save money was, again, because of the pandemic. we were facing massive economic lockdowns and social distancing orders in 2020. This meant that nobody was able to work, at least not work like they normally were able to do. So they were going to start bringing in a lot less money, and that meant that businesses were going to make a lot less money too. If businesses start making a lot less money, then they don't have money to pay their people, and they are going to start going under. And if people stop making a lot less money, then they have less money to pay their bills. That can create an economic collapse. So I think a lot of people decided that they needed to save money, and they absolutely had to save money because they didn't have a job that they could support their standard of living anymore. So people moved out of apartments and homes in New York City, San Francisco, LA, and a ton of these other big cities and headed to the suburbs. Now, this big migration of people moving from cities to the suburbs has happened before. Like I said, in the 90s, people moved from suburbs to the cities. However, there just is only so much to go around in the suburbs too. There are only so many homes, and there are only so many jobs in the suburbs, which means jobs and also homes started to become in short supply. And of course, that has been coupled with the Federal Reserve and some of the actions that they have taken over the last 2 years. We obviously have had trillions of dollars pumped into our economy with stimulus measures. We have also had a lot of Americans saving money because the federal government has put off some mandatory payments like the mortgage moratorium program, and some federal student loans have been paused through January of 2022. So Americans are saving a ton of money, and they're getting a ton of money from stimulus checks. The Federal Reserve also decided to drop its benchmark interest rates to around 0%. So Americans are getting thousands of dollars in stimulus. They're also saving money because they don't have to make mandatory payments on their loans, and they have an opportunity to get a mortgage at a very, very low price. This meant that millennials who are already living in the suburbs were finally ready to get a home, but they're going to have stiff competition from millions of people moving out of our major cities. So over the past 2 years, housing exploded. We did not have enough supply on the market, and the demand was way higher than anybody could have expected. Now, this was good for our economy in terms of spending and in terms of getting us out of the recession, but it hurt a lot of people in terms of finding homes. In addition, we also had another great shift that happened in 2020: work from home. Millions of people who were still keeping their jobs during the pandemic were sent home. Now they were able to keep their incomes, but that office lifestyle is starting to go away. So people needed to upgrade so they could have space to live in. And a lot of people who are living in a one-bedroom studio in an apartment don't really have the space to do a lot of their work. In addition, if people lived with a roommate that was either always home or had a lot of people over, you couldn't take meetings while your friend is jamming to The Weeknd in the background. I mean, I guess some people could, but not everyone is able to do this. So people started to move into homes and into apartments by themselves so they could have their own space for work. Big cities just weren't the place to do that, and with everything closed down in New York City and LA and San Francisco, there was no real reason to be in the city anymore. Like I said, the reason that a lot of people live in the city is for that city life. A lot of people do it because that's their home and that is where their job is at, but a lot of people that end up moving to the city do so because that is the culture that they want to live in. It's fast-paced and it offers a lot of those technological advancements. I mean, pretty much anything is deliverable and everything is right at your fingertips. You have any type of restaurant that you can think of, you have any type of store that is out there. New York City is the place to be if you like that lifestyle. However, if you live in the suburbs, some suburbs are pretty good. However, not everyone is going to have everything, so you have to drive or you have to go out of your way in order to get things. The lifestyle is a lot slower, and some people like that too. But with everything closed down in a city, there's really no reason to live there anymore. So people started to move to the suburbs where they were basically going to get the same experience, except for they would pay a lot less money. And this might not ultimately be a permanent thing. As the pandemic begins to go away, people might start to move to cities again, but we really just don't know what direction the pandemic is taking in because of the new Omicron variant. In early December of 2021, the World Health Organization identified a brand new variant of the COVID virus. Now, even to this day, we still don't really know much about this new variant. We know that it spreads very quickly because around 73% of all new cases of the virus in the United States are the new Omicron variant. The UK, just a few days after the World Health Organization had their announcement, confirmed they had their first death from the Omicron variant. But overall, we just don't know how powerful or how deadly this new variant is yet. So people are just kind of waiting it out. They're waiting to see what things are going to be like in 2022 and beyond before they decide they're going to move back to the city. And this has caused some major problems. It has caused rent prices in the suburbs to go way, way up because there's only so many places that people can build apartment buildings. There's only so many places that people can live. It's also caused housing prices to go way through the roof. No pun intended. By December of 2021, housing prices had increased by 20% when compared to 2019. That is a massive increase, and if you're coming from the city, you may still be saving money here. That is how crazy living can be in the city. So a lot of people are willing to pay that extra 20% because they're still saving money when compared to living in an apartment in the city. But while rent and mortgage prices have actually gone up in a lot of suburban areas throughout the United States, rent prices and home prices in major cities are actually starting to decrease. This is because places like New York City just have a ton of inventory. There are so many apartments that need to be filled that renters are starting to drop their prices. Now that is actually anti-inflammatory versus what we're seeing in the suburbs, which is inflated home prices. That too could start drawing a lot of people back to the cities because right now they can actually get a steal on an apartment or a home in New York City. And as things start to open up, if this Omicron variant poses no real threat to our society, then you'll probably see a bunch more people start to move back into the cities. But there is also one other big migration that we haven't talked about yet. Obviously, there has been a lot of stimulus and a lot of reasons for people to move away from big cities into rural suburban areas. However, there has also been a lot of reasons for businesses to start moving away from cities into these new rural areas. The pandemic caused a lot of problems with businesses. Mainly, people stopped going to a lot of these stores because they didn't want a chance to contract the virus. In addition, a lot of businesses went under because they just saw a lot less money and they couldn't fill positions in order to get people to work. A lot of people, when the pandemic started, and even to this day, started looking for work from home jobs. Not every job can be work from home though. And businesses really suffered because of that, and they had a really hard time filling positions, and that has led today to our Great Resignation and labor force problems. I mean, there are a lot of other reasons for our labor force shortages, but that is one of the big ones. So a lot of these businesses have actually started to move out of the cities and close down and move to where the people are. That's why you have seen such a drive towards businesses in expanding in cities. There's a reason why New York City has just about everything. That is where all the people are. Businesses know that they can make a ton of money off of the citizens of New York. However, it was bad for suburbs because with less people living there, businesses didn't want to set up shop. They wanted to move to where the money was, and that meant that towns throughout the United States were starting to drop. You basically had desolate cities because nobody could afford to live there. Not only were there no businesses, people had to go elsewhere in order to get jobs. That means you had tiny microeconomies suffering all throughout the United States, but now those economies are starting to boom again. As more businesses start to come into these suburban areas, more jobs are starting to grow too. Now, if these jobs are big enough, you might start to see some new massive cities built in random places all throughout the country. I mean, you gotta remember, New York City was not built in a night. And if this pandemic and our culture continues to go in this direction, you might see some brand new major cities in America. Metropolises mean more money, which actually could keep a lot of these people who were transplants from New York City to some other suburban areas in those areas for the long haul. Which is actually kind of interesting because remember in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the jobs that ended up leaving were manufacturing jobs in factories. However, the people that are moving from New York City and some of these bigger cities have high skill jobs or are looking for high skilled jobs, which means these new companies are also going to move in to these new areas. So you might actually have some serious technological advancements come out of some random places throughout the country. And there might be a lot less need for these manufacturing and factory jobs, which in the short term could be bad for our economy because a lot of those jobs are ultimately going to disappear and people are going to have to find new positions. But overall, that could mean a more creative and a more highly skilled workforce is on the horizon. That is one of the other big reasons why we're facing the Great Resignation and labor shortage issues right now in the United States. People realized during the pandemic that they did not want to just work for a paycheck. They wanted to work in a position that they were passionate about. So you had millions of people quit their jobs in the summer and fall of 2021. But right now we kind of have a labor force issue. There just simply isn't enough jobs for all of the people in our country. I mean, the job market is highly competitive and the people that are looking for jobs want specific things. So even though the jobs may exist, there's just not enough people that are willing to go to a certain position, which is going to make companies either get rid of that position completely and automate it, or they're going to have to get very creative about how they manage that role. But don't think a lot of our traditional careers are going away just yet. Obviously, as more people move to places like the Midwest and suburban areas all throughout the country, we're going to need more houses because we only have so many houses on the market. So this means we're going to need construction builders and engineers and home builders to build these new houses. The more homes that are built, the more homes that can be sold. And eventually the supply is going to go way up. And as people start moving and enough people that have houses, demand will start to drop too, which means home prices are going to come down. So in short, you have a great migration of workers and people and businesses all throughout the country right now, going from these big cities like New York and San Francisco to suburban areas all throughout the nation. They're doing this to save money, they're doing this because it's a cultural thing, and they're doing this to be safe. All of this has massive implications on our economy in the future, and it could change a lot of things about our culture as well. In addition, it might just make our economy a lot more diversified, meaning that we have a lot more jobs and a lot more types of jobs all throughout the country. You don't necessarily need to go to New York City in order to get a tech job anymore. You can do that in rural Ohio. Overall though, if the demand is there, our economy will find some way to work around it. I mean, that's how capitalism works. And if this remains a permanent thing and a generational shift that defines the future of our nation, really just depends on what goes on with this pandemic. Because if we start seeing people move around again and start going to different places of the country, particularly back to cities, well, then you basically have a situation that was exactly like we saw in 2019 and even before that. Everything will go back to what was normal. However, I think today too much has happened and people are too settled in, and now we are moving towards what is considered the new normal. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. Do you think that our great migration is going to continue in the United States over the next few years? Or do you think that as soon as the pandemic is officially over, people are going to go right back to cities? In addition, how do you think this great migration is going to affect the future of our economy? Do you think that suburbia will eventually take over, or do you think that these major cities will once again take control of our economy and finances in the United States? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button below. Keep hustling, money minds, and I'll see you all in the next one.